If there's a French wine that everyone deserves to taste, it's probably Châteauneuf-du-Pape. It's like the gateway drug to French wine. Why? Well, it has what most of us are looking for in a red. It's rich, heady, perfumed, earthy, and fruity. And they get more dusty and leathery with bottle aging. Châteauneuf-du-Pape is very much the crown of the Southern Rhone. And what's surprising is that bottle prices here haven't escalated at the same rate as other famous wine regions, which means it's a good value. So I want to dig into Châteauneuf-du-Pape wine, its history, what makes it special, and I have one for us to try. Let's see if I picked well. Oh, and I've got a ringer. This wine is very much made in the Châteauneuf-du-Pape spirit, but it's from Southern California. Let's see if it holds up against the real thing. So where the heck are we? Châteauneuf-du-Pape sits at the bottom of the Southern Rhone Valley close to the Mediterranean Sea. It's a very different climate than Paris. In fact, it receives as much sunshine as Los Angeles. It's also old, with some crazy history. Back in 1309, right at the end of the Crusades, the French king convinced the Pope to move their headquarters from Rome to France. And that's why it's called Châteauneuf-du-Pape, or the Pope's New Castle. When it was built, the Papal Palace in Avignon was the largest Gothic structure ever built. And wine was a very important thing back then. Records date back to the 1100s, but it's likely wine growing has been here for more than a millennia. Unlike up the river in the northern Rhone, where Syrah is king, officially there are 13 different grape varieties allowed in Châteauneuf-du-Pape wine, with both red and white wines. Of course, as a geek, it's my job to tell you there's actually 20 different varieties because of the color variants like Picpoul and Picpoul Noir, but honestly, this doesn't matter because the real surprise is here. There are over 70% of the vineyards planted are full of Garnacha, or as the French call it, Grenache. And while many producers blend Grenache with Syrah and Mourvedre, making the ultimate GSM blend, the cultiest Châteauneuf-du-Pape producers, like Chateau Reyes, use 100% Grenache. And the last little tidbit I'll give you about Châteauneuf-du-Pape is how it is the first wine appellation of France. In 1923, when Baron Leroy, a World War I fighter pilot, returned to his vineyard estate called Chateau Fourchet, he saw people labeling their wines Châteauneuf-du-Pape that weren't actually from the area. So Leroy worked with a friend on a proposal for a French wine appellation system, which eventually became adopted into law in 1936. And it's the reason why Champagne can only be from Champagne, Bordeaux from Bordeaux, Burgundy from Burgundy, and Châteauneuf-du-Pape. Well, you get the idea. So I picked this bottle of Châteauneuf-du-Pape using the same advice that we have in our article on winefolly.com. Highly recommend you check it out if you want to learn even more about this region. But let's walk through this wine and I'll talk through what I did to pick this wine so you can know exactly what's going on. First thing we like to do is to take a look at the color of this wine. Well, being mostly a Grenache wine, you can't see too much color in this wine. I can see my hand through the glass, and that's pretty normal for the grape variety Grenache. Looking at the tears on the side of the glass, you can see right away that there's lots forming, and that means this wine probably has pretty high alcohol. In fact, this bottle clocks in at 16% alcohol by volume. It's a doozy. On the nose, wow. So explosive and rich in the aromatics. Cherry liqueur, blood orange, raspberries, this dried herby note, a touch of iodine. Massive. On the palate, this wine is rich and bombastic. The tannins come in, and then the finish is incredibly long. And that's one of the features that I love about Grenache-based blends. So how did I pick this bottle? Well, first thing of note, you can see on the bottle itself, it says Vieilles Vignes, which means old vines. And Châteauneuf-du-Pape is very, very proud of their old, head-trained Grenache vines. And when you have old vines, you produce less fruit, and less fruit creates more concentration in your glass. The next thing of note is to pick the right vintage. This wine is from 2020. And while vintage variation is not as extreme in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, you can definitely hone in on what you're looking for by checking the vintage notes. And this wine, this was a perfect vintage, producing very fresh fruit with good acidity, and that's exactly what I'm looking for. Next, I was looking for a wine with a dominance of Grenache. You know that Chateau Reyes, the really expensive wine? Well, I'm coming in close and trying to find something a little different. And now we get a little bit geeky. If you look at the region of Châteauneuf-du-Pape on a very detailed vineyard map, you will see all these little names. And those names are called lieux-dits. And the lieux-dits are named places where the vineyards are. And there's different soils in different vineyard areas. And one of the most famous growing areas in Châteauneuf-du-Pape is called the Lacroix Plateau. This wine is from the Lacroix Plateau, and I wanted to know what a wine would taste like from these clay-based, really rich soils strewn with so many rolled stones. Now, if you have clay soils, it means you're gonna have increased tannin, color, structure, and fruit flavors. And honestly, that's exactly what this wine has. If I were to pick up a bottle of Chateau Reyes, it's in sandy soils, which means they're going to be less intense and more aromatic. A much more delicate wine, actually. So here's the thing I'm curious to discover. We tried our Châteauneuf-du-Pape and it was good. But what about something made in the Châteauneuf-du-Pape spirit? Remember how I said Châteauneuf-du-Pape has as much sunshine as Los Angeles? Well, this wine right here comes from close to Los Angeles in the Santa Barbara area, and it's called Popstar. It's made in the Châteauneuf-du-Pape spirit with a blend of grapes, including Grenache, Syrah, Mourvedre, Cinsault, and Carignan. One thing that really strikes me about the region where this wine is from is that there's actually limestone in the soils here. It's part of the Pacific Plate, which touches the North American plate, and it's in one of the only places in California where this happens. All right, let's see how it does. The color looks pretty good. It's actually pretty similar to the CDP. The nose is a bit more fruity with stewed strawberry notes, and actually a bit more meaty, almost like bacon fat. Pow! What an explosion of flavor from start to finish, similar to what I had in the Châteauneuf-du-Pape, but with more fruit flavor and not quite as extensive of a length of finish. You can definitely tell which one is the American wine because it's more juicy and fruity. But in terms of taste profile, they have a lot of similarities, and I think that's what makes tasting them against each other so much fun. At the end of the day, wines like this are amazing to try because they are the inspiring source of what created a whole new movement of wine around the world. So in trying this wine, not only do you taste the original benchmark example, but you taste a little bit of history. And if you want to see more of wines like this, I highly recommend checking out our next video all about another famous wine you cannot miss called Chianti Classico. Until next time, happy tasting, and I have to encourage you to go to winefolly.com and subscribe. We have a new membership option which will teach you even more about wine.